Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this ReadyGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We have lots of news to get through in this particular video. I want to start things out though with AMD and an Exascale heterogeneous processor. This is thanks to several patents which have been discovered by Underfox, who is a user on Twitter. I will of course link his account in the description of the video. So full credit to him for all of these patent discoveries. And believe me, he has discovered a lot of patents for AMD's EHP project. Now, we first actually heard about the Exascale heterogeneous processor, but EHP, quite a number of years ago. It was around 5, I think, years ago. And the concept in principle is pretty simple to go through. You have a high-performance CPU, which at the time we saw patents for a 32-core processor, which of course, back in like 2015 or whenever it was, that was pretty damn monstrous, right? I mean, having 32 cores back then was just, well, let's just say it was unheard of. And you couple that with a GPU, and then you basically throw in a bunch of high bandwidth memory too as well. And all of this, of course, comes together to create a ridiculously high performance APU designed for the server market. But honestly, the project had kind of seemed like it was languishing, and we haven't heard anything since. But there have been a couple of interesting things, which have seemed to all tie back to this particular project. The first of which, of course, is AMD bifurcating their GPU's architectures. As you may remember, GCN was what they had before, for example, Vega, and then it would basically just be slightly configured differently, depending whether it was for gaming or whether it was for the data center. But now we have CDNA, which is for the data center, and then we have RDNA, which of course is for gaming. We've also seen AMD create, quite frankly, monstrous APUs. For example, the APU which is inside the Xbox Series X is quite frankly humongous, with 56 compute units, albeit only 52 of them being active, and 8 processor cores. And we also have AMD's recent investor relations PDF, which of course is for investors, which gives us insight into upcoming products and technologies from the company. I always love perusing through these documents, and you can see yourself page 21 if you want to download the document yourself. But we have CDNA, which of course is a second generation of AMD Infinity Fabric architecture and is optimized for machine learning / high performance computing. But then after that we have CDNA2, which of course is naturally its successor, but it also improves on the Infinity architecture and also extends to Exascale. Furthermore, we've also seen how AMD's vision for supercomputers and how a number of GPUs can essentially come together to share data between one another. So in other words, GPU 1 can access the HBM2 that's in, let's say, GPU 3 and so on, but they can also share data which of course is in the main system memory. Now naturally, all of those things are slightly different technologies. But you can either make a compelling argument that something like AMD's speed shift technology, which of course will allow the GPU to suck up additional power if the CPU doesn't require it, can also be adopted and tweaked for the data center as well. To give Underfox, the full credit here, he has discovered a lot of different patents, so many that I quite frankly would take quite a long time to go through and really kind of delve deeply. But one of the patents, for example, is dropout for accelerated deep learning in heterogeneous architectures. And then we also have dynamic memory management on a graphics processing unit. And if we read the abstract, a processing unit includes one or more processor cores and a set of registers to store configuration information for the processing unit. The processing unit also includes a coprocessor configured to receive a request to modify a memory allocation for a kernel concurrently with the kernel executing on at least one of the processor cores, the coprocessor configured to modify the memory allocation by modifying the configuration information stored on the set of registers. In some cases, the initial configuration information is provided to a set of registers. I'm sure someone's going to turn this into a rhyme. By a different processing unit, the initial configuration information, how many times have I said that now, is stored to the set of registers prior to the coprocessor modifying the configuration information. And as Underfox himself rightly points out, this is a huge development of AMD's next generation GPUs, but it's also a building block, a foundational building block for EHP. I suspect AMD are going to be announcing some very interesting products over the next few years, and that is putting it very mildly. I'm going to be very fascinated to see how Nvidia in particular can compete. Intel have pretty much the same advantage as AMD in many ways. Like, obviously they produce the CPU and they produce the GPU, and I know that, you know, AMD currently are quite ahead of Intel, excuse me, I was about to say Nvidia. Intel when it comes to the graphics side of the equation. After all, Intel are only just getting discrete graphics cards kind of on the market, and we are yet to see how XE is going to compete, to be honest with you. But whether Intel's efforts end up being amazing for the graphics solutions or they turn out to be lackluster, we can bet that Intel will continue to refine and improve them. But clearly with Nvidia, they don't really have that yet. And in the data center, as we start to move to heterogeneous systems, it's going to be very interesting to see how Nvidia will end up evolving. And speaking of Nvidia, there has also been a discovery thanks to our good friend, the RRA bot. If you're unfamiliar with what the RRA is, it's essentially a government agency in Korea, and what's really helpful about them is they plonk on any new hardware that is being certified by their National Radio Research Agency. This is basically to certify that if you run power through this thing and it, you know, runs, it doesn't explode, but it also doesn't transmit dangerous interference and that type of thing. Now, as usual, a product that goes through this, much like a patent, doesn't necessarily equal a final production piece of hardware. It may never come to the light of day. But anyway, now the disclaimer's out of the way, Nvidia Corporation has created a new server graphics module, and the model name is PG506. And the reason this is so interesting is because Nvidia's Volta V100 is actually known as PG500. So either this is a derivative of Volta, or potentially it could be a complete successor, aka an entirely new architecture, aka Ampere is here. And I'm actually hearing some very interesting stuff with Ampere / RTX 30. One of the things I've heard, I'm trying to actually, before I say some information, I'm actually trying to verify it. So I'm holding some stuff back, but one of the things I have heard, and a couple of people have told me that seems quite accurate, is that basically Nvidia are going to continue to keep two separate architectures. One for graphics and one, of course, which would be for gaming. Nvidia have done this in the past. Obviously, once again, we have Volta for the data center, and then prior to Turing, of course, we had Pascal. And it seems like Nvidia are going to continue this tradition because it's easier to optimize. And there is a lot of confusion at the moment for many people exactly what's going on with Nvidia's graphics lineup. Because if this is true, it's possible that some of the rumors that we've been hearing are actually more for the data center rather than actually for the gaming derivatives. To be honest, there's not even confirmation of the name Ampere. As we know, there's another company which essentially could be competing for that name, so all we can say is Nvidia Ampere for essentially lack of a better term, because RTX 30 may not be accurate because it could end up being a different architecture. What we are fairly certain of is that Hopper is a subsequent architecture, but whether that's for gaming or the data center or for both, that's unclear. But Hopper seems to be like a future architecture which is designed around MCM. Speaking to a couple of people, it looks like the GPUs are not going to launch, for gaming anyway, until at least the fourth quarter of this year. And I've even heard that this could be because of tape-out reasons. Supposedly, Nvidia had not been happy with Samsung's node that they were offering because it just wasn't up to the task for the higher end GPUs, whereas other people have told me that that is not accurate, only that Nvidia decided to kind of bump the specs in the face of RDNA 2, and which of those is true, or whether both are false, or whether both are kind of partially true, I honestly don't know what to tell you. There are a couple of things I've been told about the specs, but I'm trying to get a little bit more confirmation before I put those pieces of information out into the wild. And now we're going to move on to the PlayStation 5 versus the Xbox Series X. Now I'm going to state right off the bat that there is a very interesting event which is going to be taking place late UK. It's 2:40 PM PT or 5:40 PM ET, which is today, April 7th, so it may have already occurred by the time you watch this video, but obviously that's going to be really late UK time, so I'm going to cover it extensively tomorrow, because essentially what we are learning is that there's going to be an Inside Xbox where on the Xbox's official website, the Director of Program Management, Jason Ronald, will actually be discussing further the Xbox Series X technical specifications and what they will mean for gamers, which is obviously means, in theory anyway, we're probably going to get a better understanding regarding the Xbox Series X's specs. I will say that there are a lot of elements for both machines which, quite frankly, at the moment are very up in the air, including custom stuff on the APUs of both, the memory layout, the buses, and so on and so on. But the focus of what I want to discuss here is a Crytek rendering engineer by the name of Ali. I'm not going to mention his second name, and you'll find out why in just a second. But basically, he had an interview with a Persian gaming website. I'm probably going to butcher the name, so I apologize, but Vigeteo? Hopefully I'm not butchering that. I probably am. So if someone wants to correct that in the comments, feel free. But his comments were translated by a user on Twitter by the name of Man4Dead. And anyway, the rendering engineer was asked a variety of different questions, and you can imagine most of these would pertain to the next generation consoles, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Indeed, one of his quotes was, "The developers are saying PS5 is the easiest console that they have ever coded for to reach its peak performance. Software-wise, coding for the PS5 is extremely simple and has so many abilities that makes the developers so free. In total, I can say that the PS5 is a better console." Obviously, he's referring here in competition with the Xbox Series X. He also touched on the whole T-flop situation, which is something I've consistently said. You cannot judge consoles purely on T-flops because there is a lot more to a console other than an arbitrary number of how many flops it's capable of. You can't care much about these numbers, but if all parts, God goodness, I can't speak anymore, could work efficiently in the Xbox Series X alongside its GPU, it can hit the number in practice, but that doesn't seem possible. So besides all of these, there's a software part as well. He then goes on to state about the API in the system, and that Microsoft are using a custom version of Windows, but of course Sony runs its own OS designed specifically for their console. He also mentions that the bifurcated memory system of the Xbox Series X could be a problem as well. As many of you are aware, there are essentially two pools of memory. And he says that this, he believes, is a mistake, much like with the Xbox One. So with the Xbox One, there was, of course, DDR3 memory, which provided a pretty paltry 68 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, but this was also backed up, of course, with 32 megabytes of ES RAM. Now, what I know for certain is that Microsoft, and this is out of quote, what I know for certain is Microsoft had originally designed the Xbox One to have more than 32 megabytes of ES RAM. I'm positive of that. But by the time by the time development kits went out, I was about to say engineering samples, by the time development kits went out, the system had basically been cost reduced, and so that's why we only saw 32 megabytes of RAM, because Microsoft figured at that point that the APU would be too expensive, especially as it also had to bundle in other things, like, for example, Kinect, obviously into the console. And one of the things apparently I've heard is that at this point, Microsoft kind of had a choice. This is with the Xbox One. They could have either essentially kind of gone back partially to the drawing board and then redesigned some of the aspects of the APU to omit the ESRAM but then use GDDR5 like Sony, but they kind of had a concern that if they did that they wouldn't be able to procure GDDR5 in abundance, and they would have to cut down the amount of RAM in the console, so they would only be able to go with 4 gigabytes, and they needed 8 to kind of achieve their vision. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing regarding how that console was brought up, and obviously Microsoft really resolved these issues with the Xbox One X. They did a tremendous job with the memory pool in the Xbox One X, and I believe that it was a really, really good console. Microsoft really hit out the park with the Xbox One X. I might actually do a kind of analysis now that both consoles are, PlayStation 4 and Xbox are kind of older. I'm kind of considering doing like an analysis for both when news for the next generation kind of cools down a little bit. So let me know your thoughts on that. But anyway, getting back to the interview, he states that he believes it's an issue having this split memory configuration because it means that they have to ensure that data is fed into the fast memory, and it could be harder to develop for because of that, because they need to ensure that certain graphical assets are kept within the faster pool of memory, or that can essentially limit what the GPU is capable of. Now, if you're a regular viewer, you may kind of notice some parallels with what he's discussing here, and some of the things that I've said regarding both consoles in the past. Basically, both systems, from what I understand, do have some concessions made to the hardware. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat that the Xbox Series X, from what I understand, is a ridiculously powerful machine. It is really powerful, but there are some caveats. Essentially, from what I understand, it's harder for the GPU to be fully utilized. Basically, when you have more compute units, it's harder to fully leverage all of those compute units with work. So this is kind of contrary to what you may think, but the more the GPU is used in a console, in other words, the closer you are to 100% utilization at all times, assuming of course the workload dictates it, like if you're playing an indie game and it's, you know, super simple 8-bit graphics, then obviously that's completely different. But if you're playing something like, you know, the new Halo or the new Uncharted, you want the graphics utilization to be as high as possible. You want the GPU pipeline to be as filled as possible with work, because it means you're not wasting time, idle time, because a certain number of compute units, for example, are just sitting there going la 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 la, I have no work, I have no work, oh wait, I've got some work, now I've got no work. That's obviously bad. So that creates what's known as bubbles in the rendering pipeline, and you want to minimize, about to say fill in as many bubbles as possible, but minimize the number of bubbles as humanly possible. So when you have a wider design, it's harder to fill that GPU with a whole bunch of work and to keep it well fed. To my understanding though, this is not impossible for developers to get around. It just takes some foresight. It's going to take a while for developers to kind of fully leverage the Xbox Series X's GPU. And this is also going to be kind of down to optimization as well. I do have some questions I'm not fully certain of with the APUs, so I'm going to skip over some stuff that I'm less certain of for this video. But one thing I'm kind of pretty sure of is that the cache of the GPU between the CPU and the GPU is unified, and I believe that making certain that that cache is as filled as possible with relevant data is going to be extremely important, because otherwise you get what's known as a cache miss. Keeping things really simple for this video, if you get a cache miss, it means the data which you had hoped to find in a particular cache was not present. Therefore, you have to go out to ask the main system memory, hey, do you have this piece of data? And if the answer is no, that obviously means it needs to be loaded in. Most of the time though, of course, The answer is yes, it will have that memory which is needed. And this stuff is getting a little complicated for what is supposed to be a news video, so I want to keep things quite simple, but essentially this adds latency, and how much of a latency depends. It could be just a few nanoseconds, it could be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 nanoseconds, once again, depending on whether the data was loaded, what part of the memory. For example, if it's the slower part of the Xbox Series X's memory, it could be slower still. So you need to make sure as much as possible that the right code is resident in a specific cache. So I know someone is going to ask immediately, well, what are my opinions on this? Does that mean that the PlayStation 5 is going to be easier to develop for? And I believe probably the answer is yes when it comes to graphically demanding workloads, but with some caveats like it could be that the CPU is just easier to maximize on the Xbox because of the fact it's slightly faster. I know it's not much, but every megahertz does help with optimization, and the fact that you can run with SMT disabled. Then again, maybe the PlayStation 5 can do this as well. We don't know whether Sony do allow developers to run their CPU with SMT disabled. The other fact as well is that it's going to very much depend on a lot of different factors, not least of which, what are you doing with your game/game engine? Because currently we've heard conflicting information. One developer was quoted in saying that the Xbox Series X's GPU, as well as the system itself, has an overwhelming performance advantage to the PlayStation 5. And then, of course, you've got others who are saying that the PS5 is the thing that's got advantages. So I would once again state that it's going to heavily depend upon what you are doing with the game, and also your level of experience. And I frankly wouldn't even be surprised in saying it's going to probably depend scene upon scene. I personally believe as well it's very difficult to make absolute judgments right now, because I know for a fact that neither system is final in its specifications. Now, I've said this before, but I want to make it abundantly clear. When I'm stating that, I do not mean that the PlayStation 5 is suddenly going to magically have its GPU like doubled in number of compute units. I'm not referring to stuff like that. But bandwidth can increase. Like, for example, Sony could ramp up the clock frequency of the GDDR6 memory that's inside the system. Microsoft could say, hey, we want to increase the frequency of the GPU that we're running. We want to go from 1825 megahertz to 1880 megahertz. I'm just pulling figures out my butt. Just to be clear, these are not like figures I'm hearing. And doing that alone would increase the frequency that the caches are running and other aspects of the GPU, which would naturally increase performance. These systems have not entered MP, mass production yet, and they have also not reached final development kits. As kind of a reminder, if you think back to the Xbox One and how we saw its SDK leak, and that was so critical to me because it actually provides users kind of an insight into how consoles are brought up. Where, of course, 1 month we saw, I believe it was the CPU got increased. No, I'm sorry, the GPU got an increase first, I believe. It was one of them got an increase 1 month, and then the month after that, the other one got increased in clock frequency. So the CPU went from 1600 megahertz to 1750 megahertz. The GPU, and of course the ESRAM, because those two things were locked together, they went from 800 megahertz to 853. Meanwhile, the PlayStation 5 during its bring up went from 4 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory to 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory. So don't count on the specs increasing, but I'm just simply saying that making these kind of final predictions yet for hardware is very difficult, especially when developers honestly are still getting used to the hardware. What I'm kind of hearing is that the Xbox's GPU to fully leverage is going to be a little bit like getting the full use out of the cell processor for the PS3, where it's incredibly powerful and it's extremely flexible, but getting it fully utilized is a little bit harder. Now, of course, there are some definite differences between the cell processor and the GPU inside the Xbox Series X, so the challenges are going to be different. I'm just simply pointing out that to fully leverage the hardware is going to take developers time, but I think that they will learn this stuff as the generation continues. And with the PlayStation 5, although the developers here are stating that there's an awful lot of performance right on the table because of things like the geometry engine, what I am certain of is that the geometry engine, if left to its own devices, is pretty damn amazing. But if developers start tinkering and start to go under the hood and, let's say, write custom code for it, it can do a lot more. I actually discussed this more in a recent video where I explained why Sony had not yet shown off the PlayStation 5 hardware. And a lot of the design decisions for the PlayStation 5 were actually rooted in things that they learned back in the days of the PlayStation 4 Neo. And so I do believe that this is going to be kind of like one of those generations which is going to take a while for developers to fully leverage, just like every generation. But I think both consoles are going to be really powerful. And to remind you as well, another thing that I was told by a couple of people now is that both systems are going to kind of develop their own distinct look. And if you kind of go into this with the mindset of like, oh, the Xbox is gonna smash the PlayStation, or the PlayStation is gonna smash the Xbox, you're probably gonna be in for a shock, because I think both consoles are gonna be capable of some really impressive stuff. Just for example, if you look at the way ray tracing works alone, I'm 90% certain at this point that ray tracing works very similar between the two consoles. But one thing that will, of course, be different is the compute unit challenge between the two versus the clock frequency. Having more compute units means that the just because of how the ray tracing cores are distributed on the GPU of the Xbox, it means that you can generate more rays on the Xbox Series X on its GPU. So that sounds great, because it means you need to do less denoising for the image. Which definitely sounds like a big advantage for the Xbox, but then you also need to take into consideration that more compute units cannot come together, or rather more shaders cannot come together to help a ray while it's in traversal. So this means that theoretically the PlayStation 5 GPU may be able to bounce to more surfaces in a smaller amount of time because the GPU is running at a faster clock frequency. But then, is that better than having fewer rays? Well, that's going to depend on the scene a lot, isn't it? Another thing I'm pretty certain of is both systems have a lot of custom work in the APUs, which is not publicly known right now. I don't know the details of a lot of it, quite frankly, but I am pretty certain that there is custom work in both systems. And once again, this is stuff that probably won't even, in many instances, be that interesting for the average person to know about, because it could be kind of dry. Just for example, if we pick on the PS4 for a second, if I said to you, well, the PlayStation 4's GPU has the ability to selectively delete one of the lines of cache which was marked with compute data, and rather than needing to entirely nuke the entire level 2 cache, it doesn't sound that great, but that volatile bit was very helpful when it came to compute-based scenarios. But of course, that doesn't sound like as cool as saying the PlayStation 4 at the time had a 1.84 T-flop GPU and any of this stuff. So I'm just saying, some of the stuff that sounds dry and some of the stuff that isn't getting headlines with the consoles is actually kind of as important as numbers like the number of T-flops in the system or whatever else. So I'm going to probably say that when it comes to these articles or interviews, I'm not saying you dismiss them. I'm not saying that they don't have their place. I'm just saying that at this point, it's probably difficult to make any real calls from the developers on what they're saying. And this goes for whatever console is supposed to be on top. And I personally believe both systems are going to be monstrous. I've said umpteen and one times at the moment that I believe that Xbox is probably the more powerful console in terms of raw GPU performance, but the PlayStation 5 has some significant wins, and then basically both of them have specs where some of it the PlayStation wins, some of it the Xbox wins, but yeah, it's going to be a really interesting generation. I'm actually more excited for this generation than what I am with the previous generation. I have to say, I'm really excited to see what developers are able to do, because with the previous generation, I felt that the anemic processing power of the CPUs in both was kind of a problem. And also the sluggish hard drives in the system meant getting data into main system RAM was just a pain in the butt for developers. And this also, of course, meant that we have loading times in the console, and we have the infamous walking and talking sections in a lot of games. And even, of course, if you were then to outfit your system with an SSD, it still doesn't take advantage of that performance, because the game was originally encoded with a slow-ash hard drive without, working at 50 megabytes per second. But I think I've rambled enough in this video. It wasn't quite as tight as I'd hoped. I hope to make it a little bit shorter, but a little bit more analysis-y. But it is what it is. I think I will do a more extensive look at the Xbox Series X, depending what Jason Ronald discusses tomorrow. And there are some other really cool videos that are coming up. I'm kind of I'm working on the Xbox Series X versus PS5 in the SSD and a couple of other areas. However, I'm waiting to see a couple of details on the SSDs, but fortunately we've learned quite a bit recently about both, so that's definitely good. So that will be coming up soon, as well as a lot, of course, of PC stuff. So definitely check it out, and of course subscribe to the channel. Anyway, I think I'm going to run off now because I've eaten up way too much time, but take care of yourselves. Bye for now.